So we should ask, why doesn't Peter immediately recognize Jesus? And I would submit to you that the reason why Peter doesn't immediately recognize Jesus is because he's walking around with deep regrets. Maybe that's why he's going fishing to begin with. Maybe he's sort of saying, you know what? I need to go back to what I know. I don't really know anything about following Jesus after all. I thought I did, but I don't. And so I'm going back. I'm going to go fishing. Now, maybe the rest of the disciples were like, we can't let him go out on the water by himself. He'll never come back. And so that's why they go with him. I don't know. But you see, the reason why Peter is walking around, he's kind of scuffling along, is because Peter has a character flaw. Throughout the Gospels, you see Peter presenting this image of himself as this strong person. And over again, he tries to assert himself. And over again, you see him making a mess of it. When you zero in and really look at Peter's life, when you look at his wins and losses, you see that he's kind of this hodgepodge of good and bad. Kind of like you and me. Okay, at least like me. I don't know. Throughout the Gospels, it seems like he's struggling with who he is versus who he wants to be. And so he can make a confession, Lord, depart from me, I'm a sinful man. And he can make that confession, I don't deserve you. And he's totally honest and straightforward with Jesus in that instance. But he's also the same one who rebukes Jesus in Matthew 16:22. Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you, when Jesus told him that he was going to be crucified, when he was going to be persecuted by the Pharisees. You see, this is Peter overextending, taking on an authority that he doesn't have, a privilege that is not his, as though he could tell the Son of God anything. But he's probably not all that different from you and me. I mean, how many times have you thought, I know what's best here. If God would just agree with me, we could solve this problem. You see, we all have internal struggles. Every single one of us has an internal struggle. We looked at James 4 a couple of months ago. And James says this in verse 1, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You see, the Bible tells us over and over that we're in a fight between truth and illusion. We're in a fight between truth and lies. But we tend to think of that as only being an external fight. There's people out there that are different from us, and they need to know the truth, and they're being deceived, and we need to share with them the truth and get them on the right page. But why should we think that it's all external? Why would it only be there? James says the source, the very foundation of all of your quarreling, is that you are fighting an internal conflict. Your external lack of peace, person to person, with the world, is caused by an internal lack of peace within yourself. This is how most people interact with their world. We spend almost all of our lives trying to prove to everybody else and to ourselves, maybe more to ourselves than everybody else, that we're something other than what we really are. The most common human flaw is not being able to admit that we have flaws. We especially refuse to admit our weakness and our brokenness. We're never going to do that. Because if I admit that to somebody, they're going to pin me to the floor, they'll never let up. That's what we think. This is why I think in 1 John, John has to say, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. Because we're not reconciled to ourselves. We aren't dealing honestly with what's going on internally in our hearts. Unless we're reconciled to the reality of who we are, unless we see ourselves for who we really are, we can't be reconciled to others. No matter what we believe about world conflicts, none of it will change unless we come to grips with the reality that is within ourselves, our own internal conflict. But here's the thing. Jesus can change all of that. And the case study is for us laid out here with Peter, in John. Before we take a look, though, at Peter's reconciliation, let's remember how we got to this place. Let's rewind into the story a little bit. At the end of Jesus' life, all the disciples let Jesus down. Every single one of them. They all abandoned him in the garden, by the way. Now, John is the one that comes back, and he's at least at the foot of the cross later. But everybody abandons him at the garden, so every single one of them let him down. But look at Peter's statements in Matthew 26, because of his statements, Peter's letdown of Jesus, Peter's sort of betrayal of Jesus is even worse. Jesus tells them several times in this chapter that he's going to be killed. And finally he says, I'm going to be arrested and you're all going to abandon me. And then we see this in verse 33. Peter answered him, though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Peter said to him, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And all the disciples said the same. Now note, all the other disciples were like, yeah, what he said. But it's Peter that puts himself out there. It's Peter taking the lead. It's Peter who's like, I alone, Jesus, will be there to the death. What's he really saying when he says that? He's saying, Jesus, I've been hanging out with these other 11, and I can tell you based on my interactions with them, I love you better than they do. That's what he's ultimately saying. I love you more than the rest of these. Oh, if only he could back up his mouth. Of course, we know Peter very publicly denied Jesus. He was with a group of people, soldiers and servants of the high priest, around a fire. 3 times they asked him around that very personal fire, aren't you a follower of Jesus? Now, maybe if he had denied it once, we could chalk it up to, he just wasn't ready for the question, and he just kind of flubbed the answer or something like that. Maybe the situation just got too big for him. He just wasn't ready for it. But 3 times he said, I don't know him. And in Matthew's account, he invokes a curse and swears that he doesn't know Jesus. How do you live with yourself after saying, I love you more than the rest of these, and then saying, I'll die for you, and then as soon as the test comes, you're like, no, I wasn't with him. I don't know anything about him. I'm just as curious as the rest of you. So how do you live with yourself? How do you go and live with yourself after that? How do you reconcile within yourself the reality that you just revealed about who you are? You go back to what you know. You go fishing. Jesus resolves Peter's internal conflicts, and he resolves all of our internal conflicts the same way. So what does Jesus do about Peter's denial? Does he condemn him? Does he cast him out? You used to be a good person, but now you're going to have to roam the earth without me. No. Look at verse 9. After Peter jumps in and swims to shore, abandoning the other 6 in the boat, we see this. When they got out of land, this is the rest of the crew. They get to shore because Peter's already jumped in. He swam to shore ahead of them. They drag the net along with them because they can't pull it in. Nice of Peter to leave them to the work, right? They got out on shore. They saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. And Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Jesus has a great way of dealing with us, doesn't he? He doesn't condemn. He doesn't harp on something. He just says, why don't we sit down and eat together? Let's take care of the body first. And Jesus brings Peter back to a fire. Do you see that? Where did the betrayal occur? At a fire. And so Jesus brings Peter back to the fire. By the way, both fires were in the morning. If you recall in the account of Peter's denial, a cock crows. That means dawn was coming. It was early morning when Jesus appeared to these disciples at the Sea of Galilee. Do you see the settings and the similarity between these settings of what's happening here? Maybe breakfast would have been shared around that fire if Peter hadn't run away. But skip down to verse 15. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? What was Peter's confession earlier? These may fall away, but I never will. I love you more than these. That's ultimately what he's saying. I've given you that background, and so it's pretty easy to see it now as Jesus is asking him this reminder. He's reminded, a very pointed reminder, mind you, of how far Peter's fall had been. That's why Jesus asks, do you love these more than me? And of course, instead of Jesus just asking him once, he asks him 3 times. And all the commentaries say, well, he asked him 3 times because there had been 3 denials, and so that's why. And if you look at it, the content of this interaction based on that, you would say, oh, Jesus is just twisting the knife, isn't he? But he's not. Let me walk through this with you. The setting, the content of the betrayal and the and the restoration, the 3 questions, is a triple reminder. And Jesus is saying, I know you, Peter. I know what happened. I know how it happened. And I, maybe better than you do, Peter, I know why. And if this were just a human interaction, you might think, Jesus is getting payback. He knows all of those things. He's got this perfect knowledge about Peter, and he's just going to dig into him now. But he doesn't. He's wielding a knife, yes, but he's using it like a surgeon. He's cutting out a cancer out of Peter's life. Because the events around those fire, now Peter knows himself. Maybe for the first time in his life, he really knows himself. And so every single time that Jesus says, do you love me? Peter responds with, I do, but I could love you better. Now, he doesn't say it that way. You see, because Jesus is saying, do you agape me, which is a selfless, sacrificial love. Do you agape me? Would you go to the death for me, Peter? But Peter knows now that he can't say that he loves God that way, that he loves Jesus that way, because it's been proven that he doesn't in his own life. But he knows that Jesus loves him that way now. So instead of making excuses, Peter says, I want to love you that way. I phileo you. I brotherly love you. I hope that it becomes something more, but I can't commit to loving you in a way that you're asking me, because I know for sure that I don't. And so that's why Jesus gives him homework. More homework? This is 2 weeks in a row. Good grief. Yes, Jesus gives Peter homework. He says, do the work. Feed my sheep. If you love me, feed my sheep. And it's very important, in the 3rd question, he asks him, do you phileo love me? Do you love me like a brother? If you do, feed my sheep. Take care of my flock. Be the pastor. Be the shepherd. Be the leader that I want to make you into. The implication is, you'll eventually love me that way. Agape me. You see, Jesus could have judged him right there on the spot. There's plenty of reason to. That's what a worldly leader would have done. A secular leader would have judged him on the spot. You're going to condemn him. I see I can't trust in you. Get out of here. But instead, what you have from Jesus is this incredible affirmation. You're not done, Peter. You're not even defined by that failure, although in modern society we love to define him by that failure, don't we? There's a path through, Peter, but even though you have my forgiveness, I know you're going to have a hard time forgiving yourself. So here's the homework. Here's the hard work that I want you to focus on. You're going to be my hands and feet to my church. And through that, you're eventually going to arrive at your own forgiveness of yourself as you work for me. Jesus, in this instance, in this interaction, he's showing Peter his brokenness. And he affirms this then honestly and provides him with purpose. I told you, Peter, you are not a fisherman anymore. Now you're a shepherd.